Formula 1 98, for all intents and purposes, we're just going to get straight to the point here. When we look back at the history of Formula 1 on the PlayStation, the first 2 games that ever came out by Psygnosis, like as we all know, for me personally, are among some of the best Formula 1 games ever created, and my 2 personal favourite Formula 1 games of all time. I don't care what anyone says, those games set the standard for what was to come after it, and while we did have many interesting games, some really good games on the PlayStation, but I don't think that they captured that appeal or could better the original games. They may have subtle tweaks, maybe with visuals and certain elements and updated stats and stuff, but I just don't think they hit the mark with those 2 original games, with Formula 1 and Formula 1 97. And again, Psygnosis really set the standard at that stage for racing games, and these were even the days before Gran Turismo even came on the scene. Those 2 games really were the pinnacle of racing on the PlayStation, or even just that era of gaming in general. So when we get to 1998, which I often consider to be one of the greatest years in gaming on a whole, where we had so many iconic games, platformers, action adventures, racing games. You had, again, Gran Turismo, which originally did come out in late 1997 in Japan, but was later released in North America and in Europe in 1998. There was Colin McRae Rally, there was a sea of other racing games. Yes, there was some okay ones, there was some bad ones, but there were some games that were just broke new grounds and really set their own standards in terms of what was to come next, pretty much. But then we get Formula 1 98, which would be the 3rd game released by Psygnosis in the Formula 1 franchise. Now, in context to it, this game wasn't developed by the same team, it was developed by a completely different entity compared to the original 2 games. So they tried to do something new, and I suppose in many respects they tried to reflect how Formula 1 was transitioning at that time. And for what it did try to do, like even when we look at the visuals, like it's not a bad looking game, in fairness it's not. Yes, the handling physics, the animations can be a little bit on the choppy side compared to other games that we've seen come and go before and after it. And in respects to it, out of all the Formula 1 games up to this point, it is the worst handling one, without a shadow of a doubt. But it is very fast. Now in saying that, if you're on a more open-ended course where you've wider tracks and you're driving at speed, the handling isn't too bad. In fairness to it, it's not. You can get a familiarity with the controls, but it's on the more narrower tracks. If you race on the likes of Monaco or Spa and a few other places, trying to turn the car around those hairpins is an absolute nightmare. It's like driving a tank, in fairness to it. If anything, you feel like you nearly need to do a 3-point turn where you have to stop the car, completely reverse and then turn around, but that's not going to work, because 9 times out of 10 you nearly will always still crash into the barrier anyway, because the car literally has no turning radius at slow speeds, which is definitely one of its major flaws. Now when we look at it in terms of reviews, yes, it was the worst reviewed Formula 1 game of its time, but in saying that, there are a multitude of other Formula 1 games that came out even after it. Like when we look at 1999 and 2000, 2001, there was a sea of Formula 1 games that were being released on the system, and at the time simulation F1 games were becoming very popular on the likes of the PC. So the PlayStation were obviously trying to capitalise on that with their own flood of games, and again, some of them were decent, some of them were very good, some of them were excellent, but yet we did get a few that were on the same level as this, and some of them were probably worse. Now it depends on the player, it depends on a lot of different things, it depends on who's experiencing it at that time. Now I know myself it's not everybody's favourite game, but do I think it's the worst racer on the PlayStation? Looking back, and at the time I genuinely would have thought that it was, because I remember even coming back when I played this the first time, renting it out a few weeks before Christmas in 1998, and I was excited to play it, considering the legacy that was left before it with the previous 2 games, with F1 and F1 97. So you were expecting more of the same with this, but only to be disappointed, because it was nothing like it at all. It was fast, yes, but it was very clunky, very fiddly. If anything, you found you had to drive over different surfaces just to get around corners, because it was the only way you could get ahead of everybody, but the collision detection was very poor compared to previous games. It just felt like that they went a step backwards, but like I said, it was developed by a completely different team, and they had a different outlay of how they wanted to perceive things, and clearly they had a different engine that they were using, so it was different dynamics in play, because the collision detections, everything in the game, literally from the ground up, was totally different from the previous 2 games. But obviously it set a trend, because moving forward, the visual concepts of this game, you would see that in future games, so inevitably they tried to make it more realistic, which this game was the foundation for that in many respects. Now, I don't think it's the worst racer on the PlayStation, and I know people will argue with me over that, but hear me out. Time is a great thing. We may not have liked those games back then, which I clearly didn't. I struggled to really get into it. But even coming back, like, I haven't played this game in well over 20 years, up until I played it for this video here. Now, I set up the controls to use the analog setup, similar to what I would have used in Gran Turismo, with the steering being the left analog stick and the acceleration and braking being the right analog stick. And I found it a lot more approachable and easier to get into, believe it or not. I actually did. Yes, it does have its gripes. It's still very hard and difficult to turn, but you just become more aware of what you're doing. And I think from my own perspective, because I play a lot of racing games and I've gotten very familiar with how to deal with certain dynamics and control structures. Sometimes it's not about going hell for leather and putting the foot down and just going flying around every corner. You have to really be distinctive in your approach. You have to strategize every time when you're going to accelerate or brake. You really have to think about everything that you're doing. And it's funny, when you do that and you're patient with yourself and you're patient with the game, things start to make sense and things start to work out. Now, it doesn't always work out the way that you would intend to. Sometimes things just happen, either a lapse of concentration, you'll go off the track, which you will do in this game. And especially if you're playing on the arcade mode, where you have a tendency to drift, the back end will kick out and you'll fly around the corner. But sometimes that can go against you, but sometimes it can also work in your favour, funny enough, believe it or not. But I found that by sitting down playing it, I was actually thinking to myself, you know what, this is not as bad as I remember. I know people will go off on me for this, but I genuinely don't think that it is. Yes, it could have been better. I do genuinely stand by my word that it's not the best Formula 1 game. If anything, it's definitely one of the lesser quality ones. But it has qualities in other areas. Like, it does have good visuals, it does have a good sense of speed. It is very, very fast, don't get me wrong. I do find some of the visual elements in terms of the day and night features, especially even on sunny days, it always seems to be dull and overcast. Now, obviously you can change that in the settings, but if you just leave the normal settings alone as they are and you let the game play out as intended, it always seems to be dull and overcast and very drab. It seems to be a default setting on it, but I'm sure you can change that anyway. But going back to playing the game, yeah, where it really does struggle is when you're slowing down around more intricate corners and hairpins and S-curves and so forth. The game and the cars really do struggle with them, but on open straights you will find that you'll gain up to really high speeds. Although in saying that, the AI, the collision detection is very poor in the game, because when you hit a car, instantly you stop. You don't go and have a proper collision like you would have had in the previous games. Also, whoever's usually in first place, if they get ahead of you very early on, chances are you will not catch them by the end of the race. Especially on a shorter race, you would need to have longer laps or lengthen the laps of the race, like say at least a minimum of 5 or 10, in order to even catch first place. And even at that, it'll be a struggle. I suppose in many respects, while it's not the best F1 game on the PlayStation, it's often considered as one of the worst by many, and it's reflective in its reviews, as it was slated by critics in the reviews. And because it didn't have the same appeal compared to the two games that came before it, and even games that were currently being released at that time, like I said, Gran Turismo, Colin McRae Rally, there were so many games that were setting standards that people were almost expecting this to follow the same suit, but unfortunately it didn't. But I think it's still an interesting timepiece. It's still an interesting piece of gaming history as a whole, because while it lacked in some areas, it also did help to set the precedents moving forward in terms of its foundations, because the visual aesthetic of this game you would later see in future games on the PlayStation across the board from different developers, as it tried to reflect the overall sport of that time. So to say that this is one of the worst racing games on the system, yeah, it could be up there with regards to many, but it's not the worst racing game on the system. There are some out there that really are bad. Like, in fairness to it, I don't like to slate games off, and I know I get a lot of stick for that, but sometimes I like to see the benefits. I do try to see the positives where there isn't any in most respects, but then I've played enough games over the years to see what's good and what's not. So if I don't like something, I will point that out. But if I do genuinely like something, or if I'm willing to give something another chance or the benefit of the doubt, I will find it, and I will be able to look at it in a different way that I may not have done so 20 years ago. Again, back then I was only 16 or 17, and when we think of it, that's 25 years ago, so that'll give you an idea. You would have been young, impatient, and you would have been taking things for granted, if you will. And I think that that's just a common idea with the way we see things today, with the reality of the internet, with the way things are over hyperly visualized. We have so much overstimulation when it comes to things that we want instant things, and we want things to be good all the time. But unfortunately, that just does not happen. That's just not the reality of the way the world works. And the same, unfortunately, happens with video games. Not all of them can be great, but they do have their quirks. They do have their place, and they do appeal to some. Like, right, I may not have enjoyed this game all that much back in the day, but this would have been part of some young person's childhood back then. And for a kid growing up, and if you were a fan of Formula 1 like many of us were, this might have been the only game that you would have had to play, and some of that generation might actually have enjoyed this. I'm sure that there is people out there that did enjoy it, regardless of what other people think. Now, it's not the best Formula 1 game on the system, like I keep saying, and it's not, far from it, but again, it does have that appeal, whatever you may think of it. It's still a piece of gaming history, for good or bad. It's there, you can't unsee it, pretty much. It is a piece of our gaming history in many respects, because most of us would have played it or had some experience with it, but it's not all bad. Looking back over it now, it's not all bad. I think if given some time and a bit of patience, you'll find you might get into it a lot more than you might think. But again, that's the magic word here, is patience, which a lot of us don't have. But still, regardless of what I think of the game, even now to this day, where I do have a different outlook of it now compared to what I did 25 years ago, but I would love to know your thoughts of it, and what did you think of it overall? Did you hate this game, or did you find it somewhat playable, or did you even enjoy it, for the select few out there that might have done? So whatever thoughts you do have of the game, I'd love to hear them, so be sure to share them down in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content around many of the other Formula 1 games that were also released on the PlayStation, then leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and you can also check out this playlist here on screen to see more of those games in action. And as always, keep those gaming memories alive.